They say he dated Raymond Burr in secret. And if that sounds impossible, that is exactly why the story has survived for so long, because James Stewart wasn't supposed to have secrets, not the kind Hollywood could smell from miles away, not the kind that could shatter an image built like a monument. He was America's steady heartbeat on a screen, the honest man, the moral compass, the gentle voice that made you believe decency could win. So when whispers began circling his name, people leaned in, not because they wanted dirt, but because they couldn't understand how a man so publicly good could live so privately guarded. And to understand the reason why, you have to go back, long before fame, before war, before the camera ever caught that trembling sincerity in his eyes. James Maitland Stewart was born on May 20th, 1908, in the small town of Indiana, Pennsylvania. He grew up in a close-knit middle-class family that raised him with morality, humility, and a deep sense of civic responsibility. His father owned a hardware store, and young Jimmy was expected to inherit it, expected to live a quiet life with a clear path. But Stewart didn't feel like a man built for one straight line. He was intelligent, thoughtful, and quietly driven. He excelled academically, and music mattered to him too, so much that he developed a lifelong love for it, especially the accordion. Then came Princeton University, where he studied architecture. From the outside, it looked like his future was being drafted with careful precision. And yet, at Princeton, something unexpected happened. He discovered acting. He joined the Triangle Club, a renowned theatrical organization, and even though acting wasn't the plan, it didn't take long for people to notice what he had. That natural stage presence, that lanky charm, that unassuming sincerity that didn't feel performed. It felt real. While others tried to dominate a room, Stewart had a strange gift. He made you lean in closer. After graduating in 1932, he moved to New York City, and his life started to shift from expected to unstoppable. He shared an apartment with fellow aspiring actors Henry Fonda and Joshua Logan, an arrangement that would later become legendary in Hollywood lore. 3 young men chasing the same dream, living close enough to hear each other's doubts through thin walls. His early career was built in theater, but soon the camera came calling. In the mid-1930s, he signed with MGM and began transitioning to film. And this is where Stewart became something Hollywood didn't quite know how to label at first. He didn't have the polished, larger-than-life shine of many stars of the era. Instead, he had an everyman quality, immediately relatable, that hesitant speech, that gentle demeanor, that expressive vulnerability that made him feel human in a world that demanded perfection. But here's what people sometimes missed. Beneath that apparent awkwardness was a profound emotional depth. He could portray complex, morally conflicted characters with remarkable authenticity, like a man wrestling with himself while still trying to do the right thing. And that ability, that quiet truth, is what would eventually make him unforgettable. But it would also help explain something else. Because when a man builds his entire public life on sincerity, any private mystery becomes twice as dangerous. And James Stewart was about to become a star so huge, so symbolic, that even a rumor could feel like a threat. James Stewart's breakthrough didn't just make him famous, it made him symbolic. When Mr. Smith Goes to Washington hit screens, audiences weren't just watching a movie, they were watching a promise. Stewart played the kind of idealistic, principled man people wanted to believe still existed. A naive senator who refuses to bend, even when the entire system leans on him to break. And in that performance, Stewart didn't feel like an actor delivering lines. He felt like a conscience speaking out loud. Then, in 1941, the Academy finally crowned what the public already knew. Stewart won the Oscar for Best Actor, proving he wasn't only the face of earnest idealism. He had range, he had gravity. He could carry a film on quiet intensity alone, and that was the moment Hollywood assumed it could keep him. But Stewart had other plans. That same year, at the height of his stardom, he made a choice that shocked even the people who thought they understood him. He joined the military, not as a headline, not as a publicity stunt. He entered World War II as a pilot in the Army Air Corps, and he didn't stay safely behind the curtain. He rose through the ranks, flying combat missions over Nazi-occupied Europe. This wasn't symbolic service. It was dangerous. It was real. And when he came back, the camera captured something new in him. The post-war Stewart still had that recognizable voice, that familiar sincerity, the natural decency people trusted. But underneath it, there was weight, a shadow, a realism you can't rehearse, the kind that settles in your bones after you've seen what men do to each other from the sky. That change made his work hit harder than ever. When he returned to Hollywood, one of his most defining performances followed, a role that exposed raw emotional truth in a way audiences weren't prepared for. In It's a Wonderful Life, Stewart played a man crushed by responsibility, regret, and a quiet despair that feels almost unbearable because it's so human. He wasn't playing a hero. He was playing someone hanging on by a thread, trying to stay good in a world that keeps taking from him. Then the 1950s arrived, and the Stewart did something most stars of his image would never dare. He got darker. He stepped into roles where the good man wasn't so simple anymore. He worked with Alfred Hitchcock, playing characters who were intense, obsessive, morally ambiguous, psychologically complex. In Vertigo, a film many consider one of the greatest ever made, Stewart shattered audience expectations. The man you trusted was suddenly the man you weren't sure you recognized. And beyond suspense, he kept evolving. He excelled in westerns too, bringing intelligence and emotional nuance to a genre often defined by stoicism. Films like Winchester 73, The Man from Laramie, and The Naked Spur showed a more mature, more introspective vision of American heroism. By the time he entered his later years, Stewart acted more selectively, but he was never just a star. People spoke about his enduring moral influence, and they couldn't separate the man from the myth. That image of decency became larger than any single role, and that's where his private life became irresistible to the public. Because James Stewart's romantic life fascinated admirers for decades, gossip columnists linked him to prominent actresses. As one of the most handsome, courteous, and bankable leading men in Hollywood, rumors followed him like a shadow. Engagement whispers that never became weddings, stories that vanished before they could be confirmed. Yet despite all the attention, Stewart remained notably private and cautious about his personal life, and that silence is exactly where the real questions begin. For years, James Stewart carried an unusual label in a town that measured adulthood by wedding rings and headlines. He was Hollywood's most eligible bachelor. That phrase followed him like a shadow. It sounded glamorous on paper, but behind the scenes, it fueled a constant hum of questions. Why was he still single? What was he protecting? What did he refuse to give the public? Stewart dated, certainly, but he resisted the pressure to marry just to satisfy the spotlight. In an era when studios carefully shaped the love lives of their stars, he seemed almost stubbornly committed to something rare, waiting until it felt real, waiting until it wasn't a performance. And then, finally, at 41 years old, he made the choice that surprised everyone who thought they had him figured out. He married Gloria Hattrick MacLaine, a woman of intelligence, poise, and a strong character. And the match didn't feel like Hollywood optics. It felt like a man stepping into a life he actually wanted. Gloria was a former model, divorced, and she brought maturity and elegance into his world. Their marriage would go on to become one of the most enduring in the film industry. By marrying Gloria, Stewart also embraced an instant family. She had 2 sons from her previous marriage, and Stewart didn't stand at a distance like a celebrity playing father for the cameras. He took the role seriously. He became a real presence in their lives, especially in the years after his wartime service, when a stability wasn't just comforting, it was necessary. And then came the moment that completed the household he had quietly built. Gloria and James welcomed their biological twin daughters, a joyful event that deepened the home life Stewart had chosen away from Hollywood's noise. In a town built on public spectacle, Stewart's greatest commitment happened behind closed doors: dinner at home, family routines, private affection, a life that didn't need applause. To the world, he remained the image of the American everyman, honest, restrained, respectable. But off-screen, Stewart was intensely private, guarded to a degree that puzzled even close friends. And that guardedness became the fertile ground where old whispers never quite died. Because for decades, a rumor persisted in Hollywood lore, quietly, carefully, always half-spoken, never confirmed. Whispers about a discreet relationship with actor Raymond Burr. Nothing was ever acknowledged publicly, no statements, no confirmations. Just the same story resurfacing in the way stories do when they were dangerous. Passed from one insider to another, softened into maybe, buried under I heard, hidden inside the kind of conversations that end when someone walks into the room. And to understand why a rumor like that would never become more than a whisper, you have to understand the era Stewart lived through. This was the studio system, an industry built like a machine, where careers were manufactured, protected, and controlled. Public images were everything. Studios enforced expectations, crafting star personas that left no room for ambiguity. For leading men especially, the perfect heterosexual ideal wasn't just preferred, it was demanded. In that climate, privacy wasn't a personal preference, it was survival. Accusations alone could destroy an actor overnight. Morality clauses were standard in studio contracts, and the scandal, real or imagined, could mean instant professional ruin. And in Stewart's case, the stakes were even higher. His fame, his reputation, and his wartime service had cemented him as a symbol of integrity and honor. Anything that cracked that symbol threatened not just his livelihood, but the entire public myth built around him. Stewart understood that danger. He believed deeply in personal boundaries. He lived by a strict separation between what you give to the screen and what you keep for yourself. He didn't just guard his privacy, he treated it like a principle. And this is where the rumors become less about romance and more about reality. Because Raymond Burr, like Stewart, lived behind a carefully constructed public image, one that is now widely understood to have included same-sex relationships, though during his lifetime those aspects of his life were never openly acknowledged. If there was any private connection between them, whatever its nature, it would have been kept locked away with the same caution that governed every vulnerable truth in that era. They moved through Hollywood with discretion, intelligence, and restraint. And sometimes that is exactly what creates a legend. Not what is proven, but what is protected so fiercely that people assume it must be important. In the end, the story isn't just who he loved. It's what the world demanded he hide. It's the cost of living inside an unforgiving time when being honest could mean losing everything you worked for. And it's the reason James Stewart, so warm, so human on a screen, kept his inner life sealed tighter than almost anyone else in his generation. Here is the cruel truth about old Hollywood. It was not a place that simply disliked a scandal. It was a place that punished it. Studios did not just manage careers, they managed identities. They crafted public images so tightly that even a rumor could become a weapon, and morality clauses in contracts turned private life into professional risk. In that world, privacy was not a luxury. It was armor. So when people ask, why would James Stewart keep something like this secret? The answer is not complicated, because the cost of being exposed in that era could be everything. A leading man could lose roles, lose a studio support, lose endorsements, lose the audience's trust overnight. And Stewart had more to lose than most because he was not simply a star. He had become a symbol. His reputation, his manner, and his wartime service had cemented him as the image of integrity and honor. Even an unproven accusation could threaten the myth the public clung to. That is why the secrecy, if there was any truth behind the whispers, makes sense. And it is also why the rumors never came with proof, never arrived in daylight, and never became something anyone could safely stand behind. Because Raymond Burr's private life, too, was surrounded by silence during his lifetime, even though it is now widely understood that he had same-sex relationships. And if two men like Stewart and Burr were connected in any personal way, whatever its nature, it would have existed inside the same locked room of fear, discretion, and survival. Not because they were ashamed, because the world around them was unforgiving. Stewart understood the rules of his time, and he chose the path that protected the life he wanted. He chose a stability. He chose family. He chose a home that gave him balance and grounding away from sets and public scrutiny. Even after marriage, he maintained our strict boundaries. He kept his inner world sealed so well that decades later, people are still guessing at what was real and what was only projection. And that is what makes him different. Not that rumors existed. Rumors exist about everyone. What sets a Stewart apart is how successfully he protected his inner life in an industry that fed on access. He seemed to believe something simple, almost old-fashioned, but deeply personal, that a man should be judged by the work he gives the world, not by the parts of himself he chooses to keep private. Near the end of his life, the public image remained intact, but time did what time always does. His health declined. He suffered a thrombosis in his right leg, which led to a pulmonary embolism 1 week later. And then, on July 2nd, 1997, James Stewart died at his home in Beverly Hills, surrounded by his children. And the story ends the way it always does for men like him. Not with a confession, not with a headline, not with a neat answer that satisfies everyone. It ends with a legacy, a voice that still sounds like decency, a face that still carries the weight of moral struggle, a filmography that still feels like America talking to itself about what it wants to be, and a private life that remains to this day partly locked away, not because it was empty, but because it was his. Sometimes the biggest secret is not who someone loved. It is how much of themselves they had to hide just to survive the world they lived in. By the end of his life, James Stewart had accomplished something almost no one in Hollywood ever truly managed. He became beloved without becoming owned. Yes, the public adored him. Yes, he was a box office symbol. Yes, his image was so clean, it felt almost unreal. But the truth is, Stewart never fully surrendered himself to the machinery that demanded access. He gave the world his work. He gave it everything he had on screen. And then he closed the door. That is why the rumors keep returning. Because in a world addicted to explanations, a silence feels like a clue. People treat privacy like a puzzle. They treat restraint like a cover-up. But sometimes silence is simply the boundary a person draws when they know how cruel the spotlight can be. And if there was any connection between Stewart and Raymond Burr, whatever its nature, it would have existed in a time when being misunderstood could ruin you, and being exposed could end you. That is not speculation. That is history. That is the reality of the era they lived through. So the story, in the end, is not really about gossip. It is about the pressure of an unforgiving world. It is about how fear-shaped lives, how public images were built like cages, and how even brilliant, admired men learned to survive by keeping certain parts of themselves locked away. Stewart understood that cost. He understood what the public could demand, and he chose something quietly radical. He chose separation. He believed an actor's work should stand apart from his private affairs, that what you give to the screen is one thing and what you keep for yourself is another. And that distinction wasn't just personal preference. For him, it was protection. It was dignity. And maybe that's why his legacy still feels so powerful. Because when you watch him, you don't just see a performer. You see a man carrying something real. You see sincerity that doesn't feel manufactured. You see a human being doing the hard work of staying decent in stories that often punish decency. And when he died, it didn't come with a sensational reveal or a final confession. It came quietly the way he lived. After a thrombosis in his right leg led to a pulmonary embolism and then a heart attack caused by that embolism. He passed away at home in Beverly Hills on July 2nd, 1997, with his children nearby. No spectacle, no chaos, just an ending that matched the man, controlled, private, and firmly his. So here's the final truth. Whatever he chose to keep hidden was his to protect. And in a culture that constantly demands to know everything, maybe the most courageous thing James Stewart ever did was refuse to hand over the last piece of himself. Here's the twist people rarely admit out loud. The rumor isn't what made this story powerful, the silence did. Because in Hollywood, silence is never neutral. It's either protection or control. And in James Stewart's era, the industry mastered both. It could create an image so flawless that the public stopped seeing a man and started seeing a symbol. And once you become a symbol, your private life stops being yours. It becomes a threat to the fantasy. That's why the whispers about Raymond Burr never needed proof to survive. All they needed was one undeniable truth. James Stewart guarded his private life with an intensity that felt deliberate. He didn't just avoid scandal, he avoided exposure. He avoided being interpreted. He avoided becoming a public property in the one place where everyone is for sale. And then he did the most strategic thing any star of that era could do. He built a life no one could argue with. A late marriage, a steady home, a public identity sealed by family and respectability. Not as a performance, but as a wall. Because when the world is hunting for cracks, the safest place to hide is inside something that looks unbreakable. So what does this all mean? It means we may never know the full truth, not because the truth doesn't exist, but because the world he lived in made truth dangerous. In that climate, even a whisper could end a career, and even a rumor could destroy a legacy. And this Stewart's legacy wasn't just about fame, it was about moral trust. The kind audiences rarely give a star, and once given, rarely forgive if shaken. And that's the final sting. James Stewart gave millions of people comfort on a screen, while living in an industry where comfort came at a price. Because the real story here isn't who he loved, it's what Hollywood demanded he prove. It's what Hollywood demanded he hide. And how many people in that era didn't get the privilege of privacy? They only got the punishment of being discovered. So if you're still waiting for a final reveal, a secret letter, a last-minute confession, this story doesn't end that way. It ends exactly like it began, with an image that survived and a private life that stayed locked. And maybe that's the most honest ending possible, because sometimes the most heartbreaking secret isn't scandal, it's survival. If you want, in the next episode, we can go even deeper into the hidden machinery that protected the stars like Stewart and buried scandals before the public ever heard them. The fixers, the contracts, the friendly journalists, and the silent deals that shaped an entire era.